Shabbat Shalom. So I was sitting with a congregant in my office this past week, having a chat about many different things, when almost suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, they turn to me and say, "Rabbi, can I ask you something else, even if it sounds a little random?" So I said, "Of course, please go ahead." And the congregant turns to me and poses the question, "Rabbi, why is Israel singled out so much in the news?" It's a tough question to answer, but a good one. We know that sometimes, or even often, it feels like there is bias or that Israel is being picked on or picked apart. Although we had a brief conversation at the time, I'll share some of those ideas and responses. The question has stuck with me since. So as such, I thought I'd take the opportunity this Shabbat to explore the topic much more eloquently than I was able to in my office in a few moments on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. To be clear, and as a baseline, words are crucial in our tradition. This notion traces back to our Torah, including in this week's double parasha, Matot Maseh. It opens with this verse in the book of Numbers, chapter 30, verse 3. Ish ki yidor neder ladonai, or hishava shavu'a le'esor isa al nafsho lo yachel dvaro kechol hayotze mipiv ya'aseh. If a householder makes a vow to Adonai or takes an oath, imposing an obligation to himself, he shall not break the pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. Our colleague at Temple Anshe Shalom down the road in Hamilton, Rabbi Jordan Cohen, elaborates on this pasuk, teaching that the vows, and therefore, by extension, the things we say, are to be taken seriously. He brings the story of King Yanai, who possessed 1,000 cities, according to legend, but all of them were destroyed because the inhabitants continually swore. They made these oaths even upon that which was true. Kal v'chomer then, all the more so, what is the outcome to be if we speak falsely? Additionally, Rabbi Cohen cites Rashi's commentary on this verse. Rashi notes the etymological relationship between the word vayachel, to break, and yechalel, which means to be made ordinary or mundane. We'll pick up on that idea in a bit. Rabbi Cohen also notes that the word ish here is specifically referring to men. However, the word ish can also mean people more generally, and we'll again pick up on this. For now, from this linguistic link, we might infer that the spoken word is sacred in power. Thus, we can safely conclude that what we say, what we all say, matters. It's important to stick to our word, for our words are sacred, and conversely, as stated by Ibn Ezra, it becomes our duty to ensure that we do not profane or break the promises that we keep. Similarly, kechol hayotze mipiv, that fragment of the verse by itself can be translated as everything that comes out of that person's, his mouth. If what we say is holy, then surely we have a responsibility to ensure that the words we speak, that come out of our mouths, are honest and truthful and fair. How much more important when speaking about nuanced and sensitive and complicated topics. So returning to this conversation between the congregant and myself, let's first give an example of what we mean, as highlighted by the Israeli social media commentator and activist Chen Mazig. It comes from just a few days ago regarding the awful, horrific rocket attack by the terror organization Hezbollah, which struck a soccer field in the Israeli Druze village of Majd al-Shams, tragically killing 12 children. Among countless headlines, a few that Mazig featured were, so from the BBC, Israeli media report at least 9 dead and a dozen injured in rocket strike on children's football pitch in Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. From the Associated Press, Israel-Hezbollah fire exchange kills 3 militants and injures 11 in Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. From the Washington Post, Israel hits targets in Lebanon, whilst showing a picture of the mourners at the funeral for one of the Israeli Druze children, just by the way. From Sky News, Golan Heights attack, community devastated by deadly rocket strike on football pitch. So no mention of terrorism or the fact that there were children involved, killed or injured, or that the rocket used came from Iran, for which Israel has provided proof, or that this was one of approximately 7,000 rockets fired at Israel by Hezbollah since October 7, or the tens of thousands of evacuated who are not in their homes in the north of Israel right now and haven't been for over 300 days. As Mazik writes in his Instagram post calling these headlines out, instead of mourning our dead, we need to justify our humanity to the world. It points to perhaps the most obvious, perhaps the most simple response to why Israel feels so singled out, which is straight up anti-Semitism. Although the Hezbollah rocket strike did not directly hit Jews or a Jewish site, outside of it being terrible due to the killing of these 12 innocent children, which is, of course, horrendous enough, what makes it even worse is that it didn't matter whether the rocket hit a home or a school or a hospital or a synagogue or a playground. The aim was purely and simply to attack and cause damage to Israel, as the only country in the world where Jews are the majority and where Jews hold power. As Mazik alludes to, the words chosen to report it were subsequently so deeply hurtful because they did not hold Hezbollah to account, did not discuss their cruel intentions, and ascribed false blame in making it seem that this brutal strike and Israel's retaliation, because they did retaliate, were morally equivalent. In doing so, the vow of accurate coverage is broken, and the memories of those children are done a disservice and an injustice. This speaks to a broader phenomenon that American diplomat and historian Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt refers to in her book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, as toxifying Israel. Lipstadt is the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism in the US and has spent her career largely dedicated to this effort. When Jews, including Jewish Israelis, are called to denounce Israeli policies or face a series of consequences, many examples of which Lipstadt gives, including the singer Matisyahu and Israeli academics Gideon Tauri and Miriam Schlesinger, whether it's being disinvited to perform or lecture or write, then that's an unfair bias. And we need to ask where that bias comes from and where it rests. This toxification, by the way, applies equally to non-Jews, and this was something that was most fascinating to me. Lipstadt notes this using the pertinent example, because she's performing in Toronto later this year, of Taylor Swift on a previous tour who expressed interest in performing in Israel. Swift was then attacked in the media by Rama Kudaini of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, speaking to a website known as The Daily Beast, that an appearance in Israel would help whitewash the denial of Palestinian rights and would threaten her career. In other words, when it comes to Israel and the news cycle, and indeed Israel's broader relationship with the public sphere, the problem and where it becomes that crossing that line of anti-Semitism is that the problem may be Jews in power, and Jews having a say in how they live their lives, academically, culturally, militarily, in terms of security, and so on, irrespective of the reality on the ground. Taking a more moderate tone and to complicate the conversation, we can also turn to geopolitical considerations surrounding Israel. Regardless of what you think or feel about the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, we can look at his speech to the US Congress just over a week ago, in which he addressed this unique aspect of Israel's identity. whilst he argued that America was ultimately Iran's most significant foe, deeming America the guardian of Western civilization and the world's greatest power, he sought all equally to position Israel as the United States' strongest ally in the region, stating, "Our enemies are your enemies, our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory." In other words, he was trying to make the point that, hey, Israel and America are on the same page. They share the same values, fight for the same causes, and at the same time, remember who's on the ground and who are the ones doing battle, even as we speak back then and right at this moment. America may be symbolic of everything that Iran and its proxies might hate, might fight and rebel against. I know we're all holding our breath this Shabbat, but Israel is the one taking the hits for the team and has paid the heavy price, was the undertone. Netanyahu made clear Israel's gratitude for America's partnership and support, and in a bipartisan way, considering the upcoming election. Nonetheless, he subtly addressed the complications of Israel being both aligned with the West, whilst being ideologically aligned with the West, whilst being geographically in the Middle East, as simultaneously a democracy and a Jewish state in that region. We can take a step back, though, and complicate things further, because I'd also argue that there's an element to this where we can and perhaps should be reminded of the high standards that we hold ourselves to as Jews as well. This is, to be clear, not meant to sound like victim blaming or to suggest in any way that Israel is responsible for the way that much of the world reports on them. It's simply to state that internally, it's good for us and important for us to have healthy checks and balances and boundaries to ensure that we're living up to the best of who we want to be and who we expect ourselves to be as a people and nation. We are, after all, the people who define ourselves, inspired by the book of Isaiah, as an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, tasked with being an example and a moral beacon to the world at large. Rabbi David Wolpe speaks to this idea and refers to the Jewish people as a phoenix pursued by arsonists who, to paraphrase, turns flames into a source of illumination like a biblical pillar of fire in the dark of the desert, kindling sparks of holiness amid destruction. And the flames that have surrounded Israel are returned as light unto the nations of the world. May it be so. We are equally a people who are commanded in the book of Leviticus, Kedoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy. As 16th century commentator Rabbi Moshe Alshich teaches, this injunction is given to one large assembly and not just one Israelite individual or even a small select group of Israelites, so that we can understand that ethical and moral behavior belongs to all of us, to each ish, and not just the elite or extra pious. This word kadosh carries the connotation of being separate in our religion and in our tradition, which is very much based on distinctions between meat and milk, for example, when it comes to kashrut, between Shabbat or Chagim and weekdays, and even that word kiddushin, which means a marriage, as we're celebrating with McCarroll and Herschel today and tomorrow, which is the distinction between being not married to being married, and has that connotation with it. As we've seen in the news, as we continue to see, not all distinction is necessarily positive when it comes to Israel or her people, but it is upon us to make it so by living up to our heritage of holiness. Which leaves us a question. How can we distinguish if it's something untoward that we need to light the spark about? You could take the approach that Deborah Lipstadt describes concerning anti-Semitism, which is to rely on knowing it when you see it. And often our gut, our intuition, has something good to say. If we take some of the other gleanings from her writings, Lipstadt believes that anything that we see which seeks to delegitimate the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, or which dehumanizes Israelis or Jews, is a possible line to examine. This could take the form she makes the case in an article, an individual journalist, or even an organization. The one she uses is the BDS movement, leveling unfounded accusations, or making Israelis or Jews, or even, as we've used the examples of, sometimes even non-Jews and non-Israelis, the spokespeople for Israeli governmental policies when they have nothing to do with them. Chen Mazig brings his own take and points to a social media post, in his social media post to other places online that use the word Zionist as a derogatory slur. This is in light of the phenomenon of many participants on various platforms substituting the word Jew with Zionist, using this proxy of sorts to spread anti-Semitic tropes about Jews, all of the classics, controlling the media, or to dehumanize Jews or call for harm against us. We now know that the internet conglomerate Meta, and this is where I learned from Mazig about this phenomenon, is vowing to be more discerning and to remove such vitriol online. The hope and the goal is that this step will reduce hateful language and protect Jews, whilst allowing for valid criticism of Israel as a state. A final tidbit from our Torah. Our colleague, Cantor Josh Breitzer of Congregation Beth Elohim in New York City, points out that our parasha contains the rarest cantillation sequence, the trope marks that signal to us how the Torah should be chanted. So it's found in the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verse 5. We didn't hear it, but we can seek to understand it together. It's on page 1124 of the Plaut for anyone interested. And the relevant excerpt reads, though I'm not going to sing it, Umarotem michutz la'ir et pa'at kedma alpayim ba'amah. And you can see these two little marks above ba'amah that almost look like little horns or little magnifying glasses, and it's called Yerach ben Yamo. Cantor Breitzer posits why this section of all the possible sections of the Torah warrants such special, to use his words, melodic examination. In this verse that appears to speak merely of how far the Levites can let their cattle roam. He suggests that the solution lies in the emphasis on the syllable ma in be'amah, which means what in Hebrew. Subsequently, we're urged not just to see the words in the scroll or on the page, or to hear the word as others interpret them, but to listen to what they sound like as they're put to melody and to marking. Like a headline in the news, we can ask ourselves, how does it change our focus when we pay attention to all the ways that the stories can be told and to the story underneath the story? Let us stay attuned. As we reach the end of Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers this Shabbat, as with every book of Torah, we end with the words chazak, chazak v'nit chazek, be strong, and have strength. As Israel faces difficult days and difficult decisions ahead, knowing that whatever happens, it will be written about and it will be spoken about in ways that might be upsetting and confusing to her people the world over. Let this be our prayer, that we ourselves may be strengthened and strengthen one another in turn. Shabbat Shalom.